Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Security Repo Podcast. We got a great episode for you today, and yet again, I am joined by our awesome co-host, Kazar.
Hi, everyone.
Good to see you again, man. This week, we're joined by a very special guest, Coburn Slay. He's a passionate and driven young cybersecurity professional based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His love for technology began at a young age, fueled by knowledgeable mentors and a natural curiosity to understand how things work. This drive has led Coburn to explore unique fields within cybersecurity, where he's been able to gain hands-on experience and contribute to innovative research in the ever-evolving tech landscape. Welcome to the show, Coburn.
Hey, thank y'all for having me.
So we met back at Sauce Fusion, the OpenSSF conference, I guess a couple months ago at this point, and you work in a very interesting field, especially for somebody that's at a cloud computing and cloud tooling conference, and that is the world of flight simulators. Mm-hmm. Like not the fun ones you do for funds on your laptop, but the actual giant physical boxes you climb into to learn to be a real pilot. Let's just start there. Can you give us some light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the big thing is that got into that fairly young and early. It's actually a fairly popular industry within Tulsa. So Tulsa is a known aviation. That's one of their focuses. They're working with aviation, and so we have a lot of different flight simulation companies that are there. The company that I work for, there's a company called Flight Safety that is there, much bigger than we are, and that obviously when you go to different work. At college, when you're looking for jobs, they're always posting. And I saw the cybersecurity opportunity pop up, and I was like, oh, this will be obviously very interesting, right? Because flight simulation, unlike your standard cloud computing environments, not just a couple of you're not doing network security per se, we do, but you're doing the entire, mostly edge computing systems, right? Because you're working with everything from a modern system to something that might be a lot older, right? Depends on when the simulator was built, that kind of thing. And it makes it for very challenging, but also very fun opportunities to learn old and new technology, especially when you have to integrate that all together and then submit work with the threat landscape and understand hey, how do we mitigate risk on a flight sim? Tons of fun.
So this is a very old technology. Flight simulators have been around for a while. I'm thinking World War II era. Or are you talking about machines this old, or are we talking brand new, state of the art, just rolled off the assembly line flight simulators, or they're a mix?
So you have a mix. So a good example of things like the B-52 simulator. The B-52 is way older than me. He's a World War II type of plane. He has a sim, and it's going to be almost completely mechanical. I've got the incredible opportunity to talk with guys who just either in work or at conferences, whenever we go to flight simulation-based conferences, they've been in the field longer than I've been alive. And they talk about they remember when their sims got upgraded to have actual platters for hard drives. That was an upgrade. They remember that type of stuff. Or they remember moving to 44p, IBM 44ps, right? From standard just flipping switches and then loading tapes. And so you'll see sims that are that old, from very old plane platforms to much more modern stuff, right? Because, we're making new jets all the time, both for commercial or not commercial. And when a new plane is made, then a flight sim is also made with it. And they are typically a lot newer, right? So you'll see some really cool stuff like virtual reality or augmented reality simulation and that kind of thing. Of course, it's always very funny because you'll see certain systems wow, this is super new. And then obviously under the hood, that system's been under support for 20, 30 plus years. And it's just a lot of fun because, when you're actually digging into the nuts and bolts of it, you're wow, this code base has been worked on since the 80s, or, this visual system that we're using is, something that's been around for a long time. And how do we integrate that into modern cybersecurity requirements, especially with stuff like NIST and stuff like that, when they push new recommendations down, that kind of thing.
This is honestly quite fascinating because it means that basically you've got a fleet of IoT devices, and I'm not sure that definition applies here, but you get my point. You've got a fleet of machines that are running all over the place, and you've got to manage them centrally and provide support to all these machines. And that raises, of course, a tremendous amount of questions in terms of security. And the first one I'd like to ask is, what's your threat model? And I'm not sure you can discuss that maybe today with us, but honestly, I'm quite curious to know, do you fear, like, for example, physical attacks? Are these machines connected to the network, and do you fear network attacks? What sort of thinking do you have on this sort of topic?
So flight simulation, really, if you take a step back, threat model is very similar to other IoT, especially like if you look at power grid, for example, or something like that, where a lot of it is physical, right? So you'll have some type of networks sometimes, right? Sometimes they're persistent, sometimes they're not persistent. This will depend on the mission for the flight sim. I know like lots of commercial sims, they tend to be fully networked all the time. And they have some type of centrally managed system, something like SCCM or something else, if they're Windows like endpoints. And that is, fairly tightly like maintained, right? Because hey, like sometimes they, plug a SIM in, and then from there you can then log in remotely, and you can help manage them from maybe a SOC, not really a SOC, because it's not quite that organized, but it'd be something similar like a call center, right, or any type of support center. So, that is always a worry, but really a large portion of it is worrying about the physical access aspect of it. In fact, like the age-old classic everyone loves to talk about is Stuxnet, right? So like stuff like Stuxnet, like watching, hey, like you don't plug like rogue USB devices in, or watching like when we do move data onto or off of these endpoints, like making sure that they are, properly audited and that kind of thing. And that's the biggest concern typically, is the data exchange. Like that's, where the big portion of the threat model is focused on. That, and of course, managing your endpoints, and we're also, just as other IoT industries are doing, we're really starting to get into more supply chain security, more bill of material audits from software, that kind of thing.
Well, all right then. You just mentioned SBOM software and supply chain security.
Yes.
And, that raises, of course, the obvious problem of how do you get these updates to your fleet of flight simulators? Do you guys have a technician walk up to the machine, plug into a new drive that loads new firmware? Do you do that over the air? How does that work?
So updates are going to depend on the platform and the infrastructure, right? I mean, this is the age-old like OT problem, where infrastructure it just matters, right? Every single system you work on, not even flight simulation, but anything else that's edge, might have some type of ability to host centrally managed repositories, do things like WSUS if you're a Windows shop, or some type of package management deployment. Other systems, right, you would have to do updates by hand with a technician, and that's going to depend on whichever like company you work for, or whatever flight simulator you walk on. You can walk through the door and you'll see very like modern flight sims are going to have modern solutions to those update problems. Older flight sims may not. It just depends on when they were built, what their focus is, and their mission, of course, right? And of course, probably money too, as it all boils down to at the end of the day.
So a couple points there kind of lead us back to where we met, I think. OpenSSF makes tools around this, and I don't know if you saw the presentation on ZARF. For those of you who don't know, ZARF is an OpenSSF project built to make updating air-gapped systems much easier. I'm not here to promote it; just it's free, open source. You want to go check it out. But I was curious: is that something that you've looked into?
A little bit, yes. So I'm speaking of ZARF, the Defense Unicorns, the company that I believe donated that project to the OpenSSF. And I first bumped into them through the company I buy my like laptops from, which is System 76. They had them on a podcast a while ago, and a lot of what they're trying to do, their mission is super cool. So I've been definitely following. That's how I really found out about the OpenSSF and what they do and that kind of thing. So I've been familiar with the Linux Foundation, but the OpenSSF's fairly new comparatively. And really getting into how do you, within, limited internet access, quote unquote, air gap, right? That's like where their focus is. How do you manage your, vulnerability management, for lack of a better word, updates, that kind of thing within the air gap? And it's super cool. It's something that, especially pieces of what they do, because it's open source. You can just go and look and see how did this work. Because even if you can't leverage the entire technology, you can definitely take what their ideas were or that kind of thing and walk forward with that. It's been a big thing that, well, of course, everyone's kind of looking at within our space. It's always been a hot topic within flight simulation and other OT systems at large.
So now I'm thinking on it, like, why does a flight simulator need to be air gapped? Like, I understand there's specific threats, and we're not going to get into everything about flight sims, but yeah, like, it's not controlling water pressure or sanitation or when I think operational technology, I think things that can go horribly wrong, nuclear facilities and whatnot. Why are we air gapping flight simulators, or are we?
Depends on the platform. So some commercial flight sims won't be air gapped. They'll have like certain networks involved with them, that kind of thing. And these networks help manage them, that kind of stuff. And you can look up. So like there's certain standards that allow for flight simulation to play together. Is what they use. I'll say play together, but just like when you fire up Microsoft Flight Sim, you want to like fly with your friends, right? So big flight sims do that too, and so they can on a network communicate with other planes. So like let's say you do air refueling, right? Well, it's pretty hard to practice air refueling by yourself. So it's a lot more helpful to be able to, hook up and fly with another plane, another platform that might need, to practice and train, like a helicopter, for example, or another plane train, like air refueling. And there's been a look at leveraging that type of network and that type of infrastructure to then also help with other updates and stuff as well. Now, of course, you have to remember, and I should try to press this, is that like modern, like the OpenSSF or any other like really like forward-leaning cloud computing company, they get to they're lucky in that they're a lot more ahead of the curve compared to other endpoint or like operational technology like entities, right? More than just flight simulation. We are, a healthy bit, not behind per se, but like, we're still working on a lot of this stuff because we are older as an industry, just full stop. Same with power plants, same with like CNC machines that are now being networked together, right? I mean, these things are beyond way older than, a new company like Netflix. So you have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of tech debt, for lack of a better word, that you're kind of like paying the price on now. So it's, they use, some of it is air gap by like a defensive model or air gap by like NIST requirement, right? Because if you do government work, sometimes there's just a requirement to be air gapped, and that just is what it is. But in other more corporate environments, like if you do like big Boeing 747 plants or that kind of thing for training for those guys, they'll all be networked together. They'll have some type of WAN that they're connected to, and they try and push updates. But of course, there are other problems too, right? Because you have to fight the never-ending battle of what we like to call like shift left cybersecurity, right? Because it's a lot easier, at least culturally, and this is not just a flight simulation problem culturally, cybersecurity has just been bolted on, right? It's like, oh, well, we finished development, so now we're just going to like just push it out the door, and then we'll do cybersecurity later. Well, later sometimes never comes. And that type of attitude is pretty pervasive. And I mean, you can look at things like the CrowdStrike incident, for example. Like that's just an example of really bad practices, like all around. And you see that all throughout tech, unfortunately.
All right. You definitely on point there. But I'd like to focus on newfangled tech, if you will, for a second. Let's talk about the flight simulators that you've released recently and that I imagine you release over-the-air updates for. Am I correct?
Yes. So right, it's like we do.
Right.
A lot of my work would be focused around updates, that kind of thing.
All right, then. Well, what sort of backend infrastructure do you use for that? Do you have such stringent requirements that you need to have on-prem, very heavily guarded servers, or do you use maybe public cloud infrastructure?
It's all on-prem. So that's going to be within pretty much, I would say, most things that you see government related or OT in general. My experience in OT in general, because I had an internship where I did power grid cybersecurity as well. It was also on-prem. The Every so often you'll see some white papers come out talking about building a cloud environment for these types of systems, which is very neat, but there tends to be a gap there, right? Where like you have lots of bleeding edge research that's really cool, and then you have like what's reality, right? Like where we're still like, hey, we're still trying to figure out new like technology that's probably been figured out by the rest of the industry 20 years ago. And I say trying to figure, it's just like trying to integrate well might be a better like way of describing that, because you have to be able to go to the shareholders and say, hey, like, this is a reason why we need to integrate this technology. You don't just integrate because it's shiny and new. As cool as that would be. And trying to, in a sane way, take what was a very monolithic infrastructure and move it into something cloud native is very challenging. And of course, the first gap there is getting to your on-prem infrastructure, building your update systems, building your systems that do audit logging for you, right? All your log engineering. All these things are completely on-prem, which is its own fight because it seems like everyone's just trying to preemptively just uproot and move and say like, hey, like if you're not connected to like Microsoft Cloud, then it's game over, right? Like, I mean, recently Microsoft deprecated WSUS back a couple months ago, and they want you to move to their Azure update platform, which is, I mean, that's its own problem, right? Because if you can't connect to Microsoft Azure update platform, then what do you do?
That is an interesting conundrum.
Yeah.
So, not just flight sims, but like across operational technology, this is obviously a space you're paying close attention to. Do you think there is a gap that is happening or widening? Not just happening; it is obviously happening, but widening for people that are building all these cloud native tools. Like the OpenSSF, 90% of it is cloud native stuff. Like Zarf is one of the standout exceptions that's built to deal with that on-prem air gap situation. But yeah, what are we overlooking when we think cloud native first, and then try to apply that to operation technology?
So I think that I love that question because there's a couple of problems here, right? I mean, the obvious one that just stands out immediately is a lack of infrastructure on the edge, right? Red Hat with like their OpenShift stuff, they have like an OpenShift on the edge, like whole push, and that's cool. But a lot of companies, if they're not really an infrastructure, like that's not what they do, then and they just say like, here's our cloud native app and just drop it onto AWS and you're ready to rock. And it's like, well, I can't drop it. Literally cannot do that. Like AWS is not an option. One of the things that I think is a big gap is the severe lack of site support. And what I mean by that is when you're working in these OT environments, the guys on site are not computer technicians. That was never in their job description. That was never in their training. And when you start moving a lot of mechanical systems, which that is their training, they work on mechanical systems. They work on physical, like engines. They work on parts they can rip and replace easily. Now you're making them try to maintain something that's software based. That is a massive problem because you just lack training. They lack and that's expensive. You have to take all these guys, you have to get them the training to not only work on the legacy stuff that is in fact still mostly mechanical, but you're also now working on stuff that's all either virtual or it's like software based, and also computers, and that's not their wheelhouse at all. And you're going to see a huge gap there, right? Whereas other, like we don't have cloud engineers on site, and we don't originally ever expected to staff those guys with real cloud engineers, real sysadmins. That was never the intention, right? Of course, the other problem with anything that is within OT, I mean, we were monolith by design, right? Lots of IBM, very pervasive within the OT space within the very early days. And I have seen, when I look at early mock-ups of some of this tech, you get, for what I lack of a better words, what I call like microservice hell, right? It's this over-engineered 800 microservices that all do like the same thing that ran on like one IBM 44P for 44 years. And I lack the ability to be like, okay, like we can't scale. This does not scale well. Maybe this scales well when you're highly distributed, right? You're servicing up cloud to thousands and thousands of users. And I'm willing to bet that if like 20,000, sessions logged into this microservice deployment, it would probably scale, but we don't have 20,000 users. We have like 10 or, sessions. And that's the other, I guess, gap that I've seen within cloud computing or just cloud native in general, is that it's hyper focused on scaling outwards, but not focused on the edge. And outside of maintainability, when you have all these extra, for lack of a word, like bloat, you have a whole bunch of extra stuff that you don't need. So now we have to, as like a cyber team, maintain this and look at it, update it, and it's a whole bunch of features we don't even use. So now you're training a whole bunch of guys for like us from a cybersecurity perspective. Like we're doing vulnerability management on things that like don't boot basically, or we don't even use it. It's like, oh, we have this, like this front-facing API, and what does it do? Well, we don't actually use it, but it would be pretty useful at like 10,000 users. It's like, well, we're never going to have 10,000, things logging in here. Like we're a site that's just never happening. So like we don't need load balance. We don't need that kind of stuff. It's just all very heavy for almost no reason. So when people start asking me like, oh, like, well, we want to containerize everything. It's like, oh man, like, but why? You have to ask yourself, is that actually a good idea? Because there's a reason why this tooling was, built 30, 40 years ago. And just because it's old does not make it bad. And just because you can do it doesn't mean you should.
That is some really rock solid advice there.
Yeah.
Always have a business reason. Always have an actual use case for this. It sounds like what you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it kind of sounds like you're saying in the shift to modernize just for the sake of modernization, we're actually introducing a bunch of new security threats and a new like attack surfaces.
Yes. So that's where I'm going with that essentially, right? Is that your attack surface is getting exponentially larger for almost what feels not no reason per se, but not a good one. I am all for a lot of really cool tech, especially in like a lab environment, right? Where you can just kind of have fun and play with all sorts of very like unique technology, especially to get your hands, dirty with something that's very new. But when it comes to putting stuff in prod, you really always need to ask yourself, like, why are we doing this? Right? I mean, very, very often I see, and the cybersecurity struggles with this too. This is not just a cloud only problem. Like it's like, we have 8,000 tools that all do like 5 things. And to some extent, your tooling comes with a lot of very cool features. But how many of these features do I actually need? And can I just spin up like a CentOS box with syslog on it, and does it do everything I needed it to do? And if the answer is yes, then you probably don't need Splunk. Like, I don't need Splunk Enterprise to manage 20 endpoints. I don't need the most advanced form of Tenable Security Center to manage 20 endpoints. right, with one Nessus scanner. Like, I just don't. I mean, of course, like, those tools scale great at an enterprise with 50, 100,000 endpoints. But I'm not there. And we're never going to be there, not for anything operational. Not for anything that like expects that. Of course, I'm not saying that we don't need log auditing. We don't need that type of normalization and processing. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we lack either representation, or I guess people who are really pushing this voice of like, hey, like, we need tooling that's sane. You know, when I have a hypervisor maybe that's expected to be in service for 20 years, right? Because that's what OT expects. We expect to drop this computer down and like almost never touch it unless we're doing some type of maintenance or update to it. That's like what the site techs expect. It's what the industry expects. That's the culture. And, you know, you're telling these people like, oh no, like this is like, it's going to be doing all these extra features. Like, they don't want that. They just want this to be, they want it to KISS. Like, they want it to be very simple. And that's how everything else was produced in that industry, except for the tech that's now being just thrown at it. And I think that's what the gap is. I can't tell if it's the age-old classic of like an engineer's like, oh, like, you know, like React came out, so now we have to use React. Well, actually, now React's worthless. Like, we need to move to. And it's like, okay, so like, calm down, take a deep breath, because I need tools that work first. I don't really care, you know, what type of like application this is. I don't care about how well it scales. It needs to turn on, and it just needs to run every day. And that's, I think that's the gap.
Simplicity is quite often really underrated, to be honest. I would like to ask you about compliance, because it seems that you are in a heavily, not regulated, but in an industry where security requirements are quite stringent. How do you prove your compliance with these requirements? What sort of audits do you go through? What sort of people do you interact with? Like, is it someone from an outside organization coming in? Is it your own people? How does that work?
It's a little bit of both. So if you are familiar with HIPAA, our industry is about as regulated as HIPAA, which is a lot. So you would see, you know, like, so our corporate network, for example, like has different compliance requirements than a simulator. They're both very high, but they're a little bit different and mostly governed by NIST. Whereas we also have ISO audits as well that we do for other corporate entities, and like CMMC is the other big name that's, you know, coming into play. So typically we have a lot of there is now, fortunately, a lot of good audit tooling that can in fact kind of go through and check and say, okay, like, we have, you know, these things that we need to do based on this NIST standard, which for those who are interested, it's NIST 853. Public information, you can go look at it. There's a new Rev coming out soon. That's what they say. So Rev 5 should be coming out soon. And, you know, your goal when you deploy a new box or that kind of thing is your network or whatever must be NIST 853 compliant. And what that looks like can vary, right? Because, you know, with anything compliance and cybersecurity in general, as you know, it's not about getting it to 100%. Some people like to think it is. Like, it must be as secure as possible. No, it must be as secure as it can be within the acceptable risk, right? Because at some point, like, we have to use these things. These are tools, not just, you know, they're not just audit boxes to check a box on. And of course, the big fight with a lot of these compliance things is that you kind of fight the urge to say, hey, cybersecurity is just compliance. And if we check the box, then we are secure. And like, that's not completely true. But yes, so we have a lot of good audit tooling that really helps us generate this documentation that we then submit to customers, we submit to other organizations, and it's all third party audited, which is a good thing. So they have teams that come through, and you have like either, I mean, internally we do our own audits, of course, right? And you're required to, but externally they come by and they'll take a look and see our documentation, see what we say we're doing, and then confirm that what we claim is actually going on. Very similar to how HIPAA compliance is done. Excuse me.
I love people name dropping NIST, and especially if you can cite the documentation. So Special Publication 853. I'm going to go read that. That's one I haven't read. I've been looking at 56, anyway, I've been reading a good number of others recently.
Good luck with 853. It's infamous for being.
It is infamous. I was going to say, I don't know if you're familiar with it. The big infamy with it right now is its password policy.
Of course.
So NIST 853 is a little behind the ball, in my opinion, on its password policy compliance, provided that it still calls out password changes every 60 to 90 days.
Oh.
Yeah, but aside from that, it's honestly just a humongous piece of compliance requirements. I tried to go through a bit of it, and I was done very quickly. So kudos
it's
to
a
you
dry
for working
read.
on that.
Yeah,
It definitely is.
If you're there's that one, and then the other one we have to comply with, at least on a corporate level, is NIST 800-171. Equally a beast. So those are the two, and they're kind of hand in hand. So you'll see sometimes in NIST 800-171, he's newer and can be more strict than 853 in some areas, and 853 is more strict in others. But I'm a big fan of NIST. I know sometimes some people aren't. They have their own qualms with it versus like something like ISO. But I find NIST to be a wonderful governing body for the most part, and typically is on the bleeding edge of all recommendation. And if you're a big policy nerd, it's tons of fun because they have a lot of stuff.
So, for sake of time, unfortunately, want to move on past talking about NIST. I know that's everybody's favorite topic out in the world, but I met you back, like I said, at this conference, and throughout the conversation we had, you kept like name dropping all of like this facts about operational technology, the history of it, these old systems, and then it dawned on me like you're not that old. Not to call out not ageism here, but it's like, wow, you have a lot of experience for someone who graduated college not too long ago. And I think that's a fascinating journey because everybody's background's a little bit different. I was just hoping you could share a little bit about like how you grew up with tech.
Yeah, for sure. So for anyone curious, so I graduated college in 2022, so I'm about 26. And I, on paper, right, I have a couple internships. I probably have about 2 years of what you would call quote unquote professional experience. Now, my manager will ask me when I say that because I didn't really address this well on my resume because it was kind of hard to say. I probably have about like 20 years in tech, give or take. So when I was about in 4th or 5th grade, me and my dad got together, and my dad used to run his own clinic, and he did the entire on-prem infrastructure for it in about 2001, 2002-ish. And because he was one of the first doctors in the area to do what they call an electronic healthcare record, right? So this predates HIPAA, but he actually had these old Windows XP tablets that he would use, and he would actually be able to electronically do like doctor note-taking. Now this is the standard with companies like Epic and that kind of thing. But this was very new back in 2001, and he had a lot of server infrastructure and endpoints behind it. And he was required to hang on to that data. So when the data was finally ready to be released, right, like he no longer had to maintain it, he gave it to me. And we would get to sit down and I would get to play with it. This is when, about 5th grade, I was introduced to Linux, that kind of thing. So the big thing being, of course, because I'd like to get played at games with my dad, for example, right? And I had these little Linux boxes downstairs, and it was Age of Empires 1, which was a Windows game. So I figured out how to make it run in Wine, which early releases of Wine were a little less friendly than the modern stuff. But also things like
the entire day. That's just a massive understatement.
Yeah, it's yeah. I don't know if you've ever used it, but we still had wine tricks back in the day, and figuring out what rhymes with what uses what. For those who maybe remember early Broadcom wireless card drivers, it's B43FW cutter. That was the driver, and it was a beast to even get working because sometimes it just fell over. like, yeah, working through all of that, building my own shares, for example, because if I had all these little computers and I wanted to share data between them, which is always super helpful. So, spinning up Samba, but then you have to fight permissions issues. So then I had like centrally like, manage my credentials, that kind of thing. So something like Active Directory, something like that, or, just standard LDAP stuff. And it slowly got bigger and bigger and bigger. And, my dad was involved with that as well, because we would do things like play old DOS games, because my dad had a huge collection of DOS stuff way back in the day. So, we'd fire up DOSBox and we'd play like XCOM Enemy Unknown together, and a game called like Star Control, that kind of stuff, which was always really fun. And then as I got a little bit older, my dad gave me because it was all much older stuff, but it was an IDE called QBasic to learn BASIC, the programming language. So this was when I was in like 6th grade. Which it's funny because I had the book still too, the QBasic book with the software that came with it. Fun fact: it would actually still run on Windows 7, which is kind of funny. So that kudos to Microsoft, something that ran on like Windows 95 still ran on 7 somehow, which is kind of insane.
I gotta ask with QBasic, did you build your own version of Gorillas? The one where we throw the exploding bananas.
Yes. In the book, yeah, like that. Yeah, all sorts of stuff like that. Built my own version of Snake, that kind of thing. My dad had his own version of Tetris that was somewhat written in BASIC for the Commodore 64 as well, which was kind of cool. And that really like catapulted me to really get involved for like just love of tech in general, right? Because I was dual booting Linux. I've been dual booting Linux since 5th, 6th grade, and daily driving it since 9th. So it's, I got to see the rise and fall of things that, when I talk to the people about, they kind of look at me funny, right? Because, I saw the fall of GNOME 2, things like Unity, Cinnamon, the Mate desktop environment, when those things all spun up. And for the most part, it comes into handy both professional and non-professional life, because Linux is much more pervasive than I ever thought it would be. And, what I felt like is like normal troubleshooting debugging steps is something that, I've just built over like 15 years. And it did, that's what helped me get such a unique job in the workplace, is that type of very unique background, right? Because cybersecurity is at least kind of suffering from a group of people that really want to make a lot of money, but they don't really want to learn the requirements or basics of it. And I've seen that a lot when I go through interviews, because you get pushed back and they're like, well, how do you like know all these things? I'm like, oh, well, I've effectively had a home lab since like middle school. And it always leads to a lot of very fun conversations, of course. Yeah.
Well, I think we both, Dwayne and I, now know everything about your childhood, and our audience as well.
Yeah.
Let's try to dig deep into who you really are as a security professional. We'll ask you a few questions that will hopefully reveal your true identity. What's your favorite security-focused command line tool?
So easily, like something that I fire up all the time, especially if I'm getting onto a network that I don't know well, even like practically, is Nmap. Nmap is so unbelievably useful. It's probably a very basic answer, but like the amount of times where I'm like, oh man, like I just want to look for like IPs in this range. Like I don't remember, like this may not be documented, like someone doesn't know what the IP is, but it's pretty easy to just like check this subnet real quick. And so I just like return back a list of IPs, that kind of thing. Nmap is ridiculously useful. Easily my favorite.
You'd be surprised how many of our guests have already answered the same thing. Nmap is quite the fan favorite, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, all right then. In your previous experiences, what was the best interview question that you were asked?
So typically, when it comes to interviews, probably some of my favorite questions have always been kind of around, it's more of a theoretical. So they'll draw like a picture and say, hey, like so we have like 10 endpoints here. We have like a DMZ zone, and you're talking about like either like how would you go about discovery, like network discovery, and then go through and fingerprint the operating systems and look for something that's vulnerable, or B, like how would you go about defending this, right? Or that kind of thing. The other questions I tend to love are questions that revolve around communicating the importance of mitigating risk to shareholders or those who may not be cybersecurity focused. It's very easy to look at someone and say, like, hey, we need to spend this money right now to like either do this vulnerability management or this money right now to start investing in IDS or that kind of thing. But I mean, at the end of the day, you have to be able to communicate that to the people that make that decision to buy it. So the questions that focus also not just on the technical, but the interpersonal and communication aspect of cyber is something that I think is definitely lost, and I love.
All right, moving on to our maybe everybody's favorite part of the show. We love to get people's take on the best advice they're hearing out there in the cybersecurity world, and also what's the worst advice that you heard or you're hearing, something just people should avoid. But let's start with the good. What's the best security advice you can give us?
Honestly, it's always, for me, it's just been curiosity, right? Just keep that curiosity flame alive, whatever that means, right? I'm not saying that everyone has to go home and just live computers the same way they live computers at work. But giving yourself the opportunity to challenge and learn new things, especially things that are hard. Because honestly, the fear of failure is probably the biggest reason why you preventer to learning. And being able to sit down and go, okay, like I'm going to like figure this thing out today, even if it means like it, I'm going to fail like 5 or 6 times. Like that's okay. Because if you can't fail, then you're probably never going to actually learn or succeed in something new. Especially in cybersecurity, where it's ever changing. So getting that space where you're not afraid of failure, but also like encouraged to ask questions in failure, right? To continually learn. That's always been my best advice, because it's very easy to feel like you have to pretend that you know everything, especially when you're surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds. So being able to be like, hey, like I don't know what that means, or be like, okay, like I don't, even if it does mean like I'm going to fall over a bit or stumble, that's okay, especially if I get better in the process.
That is great advice. I think that's just applicable across the board, no matter what area you're talking about. But okay, what's the worst advice you've heard out there?
So at least, I don't know about if it's advice or maybe attitude, but I've been seeing a massive push in, you mentioned ageism earlier in the podcast, in the opposite direction, like where people are like, oh, like I am 50 years old, so I'm too old for cybersecurity, like whatever that means. Well, like 50 is not that old, but B, like it's frightening to me that you're starting to see an attitude where like if you're not like 20 and wanting to work 100 hours a week, then like this field's just not for you. And that's just most certainly not true. I hate that attitude. Some of the most brilliant people I've ever worked with are experts in their field due to the amount of time they've been in the field. And because, I mean, with age comes wisdom, like fundamentally, especially if you've been constantly working. So, like there's no end age that you have to say where it's like, oh, like if you're past 45, like, well, like cybersecurity is not for you. You should go and do something that requires like less cognitive ability or whatever that means. No, that's ridiculous in my opinion.
I totally agree on that. Especially as we're all getting older. That's They Might Be Giants song. Every day you're older still. But we've come to the end of the show. Speaking of time moving on. So thanks very much for being here. I learned a lot about flight sims and operational technology stuff today. It's not a field I know an awful lot about, and that's one of the joys of doing this show is we get to learn as we go. Kazar, any final closing thoughts?
Well, honestly, Coburn, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. I'm very happy that you exist, because I wouldn't want to touch a flight sim with a 10-foot pole. These things are quite complex and very unwieldy to deal with. So, hey, kudos to you on the job you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Right.
No, I appreciate it. It takes a special group of people, but we're out there, I guess. All 5 insane of us, right?